Okay, good evening. The time is 6 o'clock, and as advertised, we will start the presentation regarding the draft MOFD CWPP. I'm joined tonight by Jeff Isaacs, who's our fire marshal. Came to us by way of CAL FIRE and has a wealth of experience in working in the wildland-urban interface and not only fighting, but doing prevention work in advance of a wildfire. And then Dennis Rain, who's our community preparedness manager, and came to us from his former life as the fire chief at East Bay Park. So he has been working in this area for years and has a depth and breadth of experience. It's tremendously helpful. And Marshall Holbrook, who's our district clerk, who's making sure that everything runs smoothly and seamlessly, and all of these electrons get connected in the appropriate manner. Before we get started tonight, just one administrative note. If you have a question while we're giving the presentation, the appropriate way to do so is through the chat. We'd ask that you direct it to all of the panelists. If you send it just to me, I'm going to be busy talking and probably not going to see it. We'll also talk about the other ways that as a resident you can provide your input to this process. And to clarify that tonight is not necessarily about receiving input. This is about explaining what CWPP does, how it is intended to address the problem of wildfire and to help develop a shared understanding of the threat, which can be used to prioritize future projects. And it will also lay out the steps and the manner and the time at which community input will be received, processed, and then discussed and or incorporated into the final product. With that, we'll go ahead and get started. And thank you all very much for joining us. And we hope you find this as beneficial as we have as we prepared it. So I will attempt to share screen here and go to our presentation. All right, Dennis or Jeff, can you confirm that you see the appropriate? Great, outstanding. Okay, let's talk about a community wildfire prevention plan. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to walk through this in 6 steps. The first will be an explanation of what a CWPP is. The next step after that will be an explanation of the development process, the steps that one goes through in the development and publication and eventually updating of a CWPP. Then we'll talk about some fire behavior basics. We call it Wildfire 101, how a fire moves, what are the things that contribute to its spread. Once we have discussed that, and just as a little bit of a spoiler alert, wildfire is driven by weather, by topography, and available fuel, and that's it. So then we will do an overview of the weather and topography in our area. Those are things that we do not have any control over, but it is important to understand what they are for our area and what unique elements of the environment in the East Bay contribute to fire spread. Then we will go through an assessment of fuel load in the district to include a review of some of the projects we currently have underway. I think that's important to the discussion of how we move forward, because the CWPP isn't the beginning of our efforts in the wildfire risk reduction space. The district and the community have been very active in this over the last several years. And we think for the CWPP to be effective and to be efficient, it ought to build upon the good work that has been done by residents by the district to date. And then lastly, we'll go through the process and the time frame for how residents can provide input. And we hope that the presentation tonight will give you, the residents and anyone else who watches this when it's made available as a recording after the fact, will give them a good understanding of what we were trying to do and where we have fallen short or where there's additional elements that should be considered. Those are the sort of things that ought to be included in the community input. But we thought a good starting point, particularly given that these documents are relatively thick, would be a good starting point would be to explain what we were trying to do to hopefully answer questions about what the outcome will look like. So first we'll talk about what a CWPP is. So they were created by the Healthy Forest Act of 2003. Having a CWPP, which is a recommendation for all communities in a wildland-urban interface, creates eligibility for federal grants. And to be crystal clear, this is not a particularly large pool of money, and it's not a coffer that's just waiting to shower down upon us. But there are some additional grant monies that we would be eligible for by virtue of having completed a CWPP. But really what we think it ought to do, and will do in our case, is it will develop a shared understanding of the local wildfire hazard. because without a shared understanding of the local wildfire hazard, it's going to be very difficult to prioritize mitigation projects. And so we see this as a step to having developed a shared understanding, then prioritize areas and types of work. And then as future money becomes available, there's an action plan that is proposed that, if followed, would reduce wildfire risk. Now, what the CWPP will not do is it will not create the will or the means to execute these projects, but it will create a roadmap that, as either resources become available or the will to do that work is generated as a result of an increased understanding of wildfire risk in our area, the CWPP will provide a framework or a roadmap that will guide our work. So the work isn't done just a little here, a little there. It's done as part of a larger coordinated plan to reduce risk in a meaningful manner throughout the community. And for it to do that, it's critical that these plans be updated on a regular basis. We believe the right process for that is every 3 years, so that work that has been done is credited or scored. We do a new assessment of the prevalence of fuels. We run new fire spread models across those. We reevaluate whether changes in the weather, changes in fire behavior, changes in population density. We review whether or not those changes were significant enough that our plan needs to be rethought. And we certainly will a plan that called for work in an area, once that work is done, it makes sense to move on to the next area of priority. And that's something that ought to be a topic of conversation at least every 3 years. So CWPP is made up of 5 sections. The first is the fire district and area overview. This is drawn almost directly from the district's 2016 Standards of Cover report, and explains what the district is, explains the area, explains the weather, explains the topography, explains some basics of fire history in the East Bay, which is significant. In chapter 2 there, the second section, is a wildfire hazard and risk in the WUI explanation. It's relatively generic. Just about any CWPP will have similar portions in this section. It explains what the hazards are and how wildfire threatens homes in the WUI. In the next section, section 3, talks about strategies for reducing risk in WUI. So creating defensible space, hardening homes, disrupting the continuity of the fuel bed, carrying out a variety of applications and prescriptions to reduce risk of wildfire, while also preserving natural values and sensitive habitat and so forth. Section 4 lays out priorities that should be included in the action plan. And section 5 is the action plan. And section 5 being the operative portion of this that will provide that future roadmap to guide work. The action plan is informed by a series of maps, which are included as an appendix. And those include, among others, a terrain analysis. As I mentioned before, terrain is one of the components that contributes to fire spread, and it's unchanging. So whether it be terrain-driven fire or a wind-driven fire, the shape of the terrain plays a part in that, and the analysis of that helps inform the other components. Next is a surface fuels inventory. This is the fuels that are most likely to contribute to the fire spread in our environment and under the conditions that exist during diablo wind days. Next, we look at ladder fuels inventory, that being the fuels that will allow a fire to climb from the ground up into the canopy of trees. And then lastly, we look at parcel ownership and size of parcels. And that will unfold about why that is important. But the short version of that is to say, if we are going door to door on a series of probably half-acre to 1 acre lots that comprise the majority of residential lots in the district, it's going to take a very long time to contact 400 acres worth of homeowners. On the other hand, when there's a single large parcel with one owner of that size, it's very simple to contact that one owner. And those large parcels are much more likely to be covered with combustive wildland fuels, that being non-specimen species, non-irrigated, non-maintained vegetation, which is much simpler to approach how you would mitigate that, as opposed to going parcel by parcel, working out which planting can or will be removed, which resident is willing or able to do the work. So there is some real value in an initial focus on those large parcels, but we'll talk about that a little more later in the presentation. So the development process, it started with the preparation of a draft report that was presented to the MOFD board in draft form, not for action, in December. That was our way of introducing the draft report to the public and set the stage for the meetings that have been held to date and will be held going forward. So the first was we presented one for the city of Orinda in the same format on January 21st. Last Thursday, we presented for Canyon and Bollinger, the state response areas outside the incorporated city and town. And tonight is Moraga. On our website, at that link there, which we'll cover again at the end, or can be found just by searching CWPP on our website, there is a form to provide input either on the entire CWPP on the process or on a specific section where the community can provide its input. We can categorize it. We can aggregate ones that raise a similar point, and we can bring all of that together into one organized whole that will help inform the next step in this process, which is stakeholder input. This is meetings between the various government and large private landowning entities that have a stake in this. So as an example, the MOFD, the city, the town, St. Mary's, the school districts, Caltrans, county roads, the country clubs with their large landowning, some of the either HOAs or other organizations or entities that have large holdings. The stakeholder input is an opportunity for those groups to meet, to discuss what has been done, where there's an intersection of our desire to reduce fuels and the presence of existing plans, such as East Bay Mud's Habitat Management Plan or East Bay Park's Fire Prevention Plan. It's a discussion of those things to make sure they're deconflicted, they're mutually supporting, and that in our entry into this space, we're not inadvertently treading on existing efforts by other entities that the CWPP was not aware of. After that stakeholder input, then there is the MOFD board will hold a public hearing or series of hearings as needed, where they will receive additional input as well as from the public who chooses to participate, as well as a presentation of the input that's been received through the website and any other written correspondence we receive between now and that time. That is not determined whether that is one meeting or a series of meetings. That will really be driven by the degree that the community input suggests more is needed, or change is needed, or elements should be moved in or out, as well as the input from the stakeholder meetings. Eventually, when we get to the end of that public hearing process, we hope the MOFD board will adopt the CWPP, at which point it will be sent to the County Board of Supervisors for adoption, and it will go into effect. Thereafter, we recommend that it be reviewed and updated about every 3 years, so that we have something that is valid and relevant and reflects the current conditions on the ground. So next we'll talk about fire behavior basics. Well, how does a fire move? What are the elements that cause a fire to move and causes a fire to become a destructive fire, which is really the ones we are concerned about. So first, this is really, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is relatively simple in concept. There's a finite number of things that go into it. And the outputs are measured in flame length, as in how long are the flames. The spread rate is in how fast is the fire moving, and fire line intensity, which is measured in BTUs, the amount of heat that is being put off by the fire. So of these, the one we are most concerned about is spread rate, because as we'll talk about more later, in a wildfire setting, we are triaging and we are prioritizing the protection of life. And so a intense fire that is moving slowly will give us time to, one, evacuate the residents of the community, elements of the community that are in the fire's path, and two, to aggregate an effective firefighting force from the region to attack that fire. But a rapidly spreading fire presents a whole new set of challenges because it takes time to notify and then to physically move the residents. And it takes time to aggregate and physically move the responding resources. And both of those, both the evacuating residents and the responding firefighting resources, are going to be competing for use of the same roadway, just in opposite directions. So a fast spreading fire is the one we are primarily concerned about. And fast spreading fires, that has been the defining characteristic of the major fires, major destructive fires in the East Bay. The elements that contribute to flame length, spread rate, and fire line intensity are topography, wind speed, weather, but primarily wind speed, and available fuel. And we'll talk a little bit more about what available fuel means, the difference between fuel and available fuel, but fuel that is available to be burned. And when those three come together, the topography, the wind, and the available fuel, that's what generates and controls a fire's ability to spread. So of those elements, I think it's obvious to point out that we cannot do anything about the topography and the weather, but we can do things about the fuel. And those things we can do about the fuel we can do in advance of the fire by either removing or modifying the fuel as part of our fire prevention efforts. And once available fuel has been either removed or modified to make it unavailable, a fire cannot burn through that area. Fire needs the substrate of available fuel in order to spread. However, disrupting the continuity of the fuel bed only stops the ground component of fire. There continues to be the challenge of blown embers or brands or sparks that spread through three-dimensional ember casts. So this is carried aloft by high winds. And when those embers or brands land on a receptive fuel bed, a pile of dead leaves, decadent brush, dead grass, those sorts of things, they create new fires. And under the right conditions, those new fires can spread to equal the size and intensity of the original fire. And so it's critical that our efforts here, this is not just the linear creation of fuel breaks, because those will only impact the ground component of fire, and three-dimensional ember casts will cause fire to fly over the line and to find the soft spots in a community and spread. And this is to be a recurring theme throughout the presentation tonight and in the CWPP, which is that there is no silver bullet. There is no single solution that will solve the problem of wildfire risk in our community. And the macro projects we are working on to create a perimeter around our community and to reduce the large interior islands, that's only part of the solution. And it's absolutely critical for all residents that take to heart the need to create defensible space around your home, to harden the home with vents and other adjuncts that make the homes more resistant to fire spread. Because in that manner, we prevent not only the linear spread of ground fire, but we prevent three-dimensional ember casts from being effective. When embers land in a parking lot, on a road, in a well-maintained garden of irrigated and well-landscaped material, or on a body of water, they just go out and there is no fire. There's nothing to see there. But when they land on that receptive fuel bed, when they land on a hillside covered in dead grass, when they land next to a home surrounded by dead leaves or brush or other decadent vegetation, they spread, and they spread rapidly. And they spread rapidly in a stochastic or random manner that makes it impossible to predict where they will come down. So no matter how many firefighting resources we have available, three-dimensional ember casts will always outrun us. So it's critical that we do the work to prevent the spread of fire via embers in advance of the fire's arrival through the creation of defensible space and the reduction of the prevalence of combustible fuel beds. So as we talked about available fuel, it's of greater concern when it's in proximity to a value at risk or an area where we can fight fire. And by value at risk, we mean a home, a valuable environmentally sensitive areas, an evacuation route, those sorts of things. So if you take the example of a very large open area surrounded by homes, if we were to focus our limited resources on reducing the prevalence of fuel in the middle of the open area while leaving high fuel loads on the perimeter next to the homes, what you would see is a fire burning slowly through those areas in the middle and then picking up intensity as it approached the homes. So in fact, this is the reverse of what we want. If we are able to isolate pockets where there are no values at risk and let a fire burn with greater intensity and speed in those areas while reducing the availability of fuels as we approach the homes, that's a good use of the limited resource. Because if you look at the size and the topography of the district, it is not possible, nor would it be prudent environmentally, to go and just take down everything that can burn. So the work has to be targeted. And if the work is going to be targeted, both caused by the recognizing the reality of the limited resources available and the limitations on fuel reduction work, it would make sense for that work to be done near homes, where you would reduce a fire's intensity right at the moment it begins to threaten values at risk. It also makes sense to reduce fuel loads near defensible points where firefighters can make a stand and stop the fire. And if there is a ridge as a fire is about to move out of a wilderness or watershed or other open space into a populated area, and that ridge has good access and we have some water supplies, that's a great place to do some fuel reduction efforts, because that will make it safe enough for the firefighters to accept the risk of fighting fire at that location, giving them a better chance of stopping it. And the last piece I talked about a couple times already, the creation of defensible space around homes is not only a best practice, it is a requirement of the fire code and of state law. And no matter what else we do, it is critical that any community plan and any path we come up moving forward incorporates the need and the requirement for defensible space on private property near homes. And without that, anything else we're doing is going to be of limited value. And then just a statement of the obvious: fire, like anything else, it picks up intensity. So when it has an uninterrupted run through a continuous fuel bed, it builds size, it builds speed, it builds intensity. And so as we seek to create a mosaic of varied fuel beds that mimics the natural environment before this area was settled, before fire was systematically excluded from the landscape, we set the stage for when a fire starts, that it is small, it moves slowly, and it is either easily controlled or managed, depending on the resources we have available, and the conditions, and a sense of how we want to manage that fire. It's not possible to do that when fire is running through large concentrations of fuel, where we have to put it out as soon as possible. And sometimes it exceeds our capacity to suppress, and we have to shift our focus from fire suppression to evacuation to remove the residents from the fire's path. And as I mentioned before, when we are fighting fire, we prioritize life first, then property, and then the environment. And all of our decisions are made based on that prioritization. So when we fight fire, in accordance with that prioritization, the available firefighting resources are deployed to protect the prioritized values with an eye towards where will those resources have the greatest positive impact, where will they have the lowest negative impact, and where are they exposed to a threshold of acceptable risk or less. And by greatest positive impact, we mean either to stop the fire, or if the fire is unstoppable at that point, to support the evacuation of the community. So that's the positive impact side. And it's not stop the fire for stopping the fire's sake. It's stopping the fire that is most likely to spread to other areas. So you can't put it all out. So you pick the areas that run the greatest risk of rapid expansion or a big run in that area. And the lowest negative impact in our case really has to do with the impact firefighting apparatus have on the roadways. We have an awful lot of folks we need to get out on a very small number of roads in our community. And one of the decisions we are making in a deliberate manner during the assignment of resources as they flow into the district is, what is the evacuation traffic on that road look like right now and in the future that we can anticipate? And will that level of traffic support the contraflow movement of fire engines without negatively impacting the evacuation? So there are absolutely going to be times where we have fire engines available and we are unable to send them to the fire through the shortest route, because that shortest route will be heavily impacted by residents, and we will have to send them on a more circuitous route to access the fire, which, while reducing the impact on the evacuation route, will delay their ability to engage. And then lastly, as with everything else, we have to do a risk assessment to determine, is the risk that they are accepting by being deployed to this area, is it worth what we are gaining? And is that a place with an acceptable level of risk that we are willing to put them on that ridge, on that hill, up that long road, up that long driveway, with a certainty that they will be exposed to risk that is an acceptable level? If there is a home surrounded by heavy vegetation at the end of a half-mile driveway mid-slope, and there has been no preparatory work along either the driveway or around the home, that's the sort of environment where we'd say it is not worth putting these firefighters at the end of that very long driveway, where they're very likely to be cut off and isolated by the fire spread, to defend a home that has a very low probability of success. So we do a risk assessment and risk management to ensure that the risk being accepted is worthy of the reward and the payoff. And then for wildfire fighter, it's very mobile. This is not a case where an engine plugs into a hydrant and doesn't move. Resources are mobile because the fire is mobile, and they're rapidly hopscotching from assignment to assignment in order to try to stay ahead of the fire. And their subsequent assignments are largely based on the fire's behavior. Given our location in the middle of the Greater Bay Area, we will have an awful lot of resources coming very, very quickly. We saw that firsthand during the Merrill Circle fire, where in very short order, we had an awful lot of resources on scene due to the mutual aid system. They seamlessly integrated, the communications were integrated, everything about that was great. It's just the limitation is going to be the evacuation route also being used as our access route to get to the fire. Will slow or delay that response as we route them in manners that reduces the impact on outflowing residents. So next we'll take a look at weather and topography. These are the factors that influence fire spread. So fires can generally be either wind driven, where the wind is the primary driver of fire spread. They can be fuel driven, which is where you see that, say in the Great Basin, with a fire burning through a conifer forest, where the amount of heat and so forth being generated means regardless of the wind, the fuel is going to carry the fire in the direction that the fire is going to go. Or topography driven, where you see like an upslope run or up a draw or a valley, a fire can make a very rapid run as it is pulled by topography. And as heat rises, a fire tends to burn faster uphill. Now, the reason there are three different categories, though, that while all three of these, wind, fuel, and topography, will contribute to any given fire to some degree, one of them is going to be the primary spread. And in the Bay Area, the most destructive fires in our fire history in this area are wind-driven. And they're wind-driven during diablo winds in the fall coming out of the north and northeast. The 1923 Berkeley Hills Fire, which started in Wildcat Canyon in the district, in the fire district, and burned up and over the hills and destroyed a significant portion of the city of Berkeley. The 1970 Fish Fire up around the tunnel, above the tunnel, which started right on the edge of the district. And then the 1991 tunnel fire that many of our residents experienced firsthand. All of those were wind driven. All of them, after a quick uphill run at the beginning, made massive downhill runs when driven by the winds. And winds, there's a couple of factors that go into how wind affects a fire. And really, it comes down to where they're measured. So the 20-foot winds are categorized as surface winds. But as anyone who's seen a fire burning, fire burns generally on the ground, not at 20 feet. So the wind we're really concerned about is a mid-flame height wind, which is burning down to the level that's directly affecting the fire. And those winds are modified or corrected, if you will, by whether they are burning an area that's unsheltered. So think just a grassy field, partially sheltered, where you have some trees and some brush and some other things that protect the ground from the full value of the wind, or fully sheltered, which looks and feels like a north-facing slope in the Bay Area, where you have things that are protecting the ground from seeing the full value of the wind. And then you also have what type of wind affects the fuel moisture, which has to do with their available. So if the wind is coming from the west, which is our typical weather pattern that we see throughout the spring and summer, in the afternoon, the winds come up and they bring with them the fog and all that moisture-laden air coming off the bay and the Pacific Ocean. But during a diablo wind event, we see winds coming out of the north and the northeast. This is very dry air coming down out of the Great Basin, out of the Central Valley, that has the effect of bringing this dry air in that drops fuel moistures dramatically at the same time winds rise. As I'm sure everyone knows at this point, our major diablo wind events occur in the late summer and fall. And not only do you see those high winds, but you see very low relative humidity, and it falls very, very suddenly. And at the same time, as a result of a number of factors to include climate change, which has caused a compression of the rainy season, by the time we get into the late summer and fall, that vegetation, the environment, those fuels, they haven't seen rain sometimes in as long as 6 months. And so they're tremendously dried out and the vegetation is stressed. And it's been a long time since they've seen water. And the primary way that they're uptaking moisture to make those fuels unavailable is from the ambient environment, from the air. And when those low RHs, they come with the diablo winds, just suck the moisture out of that vegetation. As I mentioned, we had those major fires in 1923, 1970, 1991. We also saw those major North Bay fires in 2017, 18, and 20 that were driven by those same diablo wind events. And 19 of the 20 most destructive fires in California have occurred during that late summer and fall period from August to December. And 15 of those 20 have occurred in the last 5 years. So this is a problem that is getting worse. It's not going away. And we're not going to just wait our way out of this. This is going to require a fundamental change in our approach to the environment in order to protect our community from the loss that many other communities have recently experienced. So on the left side, you see an animation just showing how that dry air flowing out of the Great Basin and down the valley, and the Santa Ana winds coming out of the desert. In our case, that wind is funneled down the Central Valley, the northern Central Valley. And the Bay Area is the opening to the sea. It's the one break in the coastal range where the Delta pushes through. And that break, that low ground created by the Delta, has the effect of pulling those dry winds through, which is why the Bay Area has such an exposure to those diablo wind events. And on the right side, you see a graph shown from one of our fire sensors 2 years ago. And on the top, you see temperature, and on the bottom, you see relative humidity. And so on that night in October, at about 1 in the morning, we see temperature start a really dramatic rise, which is atypical for 1 in the morning. And we see humidity, where that little kind of crude red arrow is sketched, you see humidity just fall to the floor. So this is the onset of a Dabla wind event. This is the sort of thing that represents the onset of critical fire danger weather in the middle of the night. So it comes on very suddenly, and typically these events last from 12 to 18 hours. Sometimes they can be multiple days, but the big wind events are usually isolated to about 12 or 18 hours. And that also aligns with when the destructive fires in the East Bay Hills have made about 12-hour very big runs. And then the weather changes and lets up. What's been new over the last several years, we saw this in the Napa fires in 2017. We saw it in the Kincaid fire and to a degree on the Camp Fire, is that these wind events are becoming more extended. Wind event on top of wind event. And so it was once a 12-hour fire and we were out then picking up the pieces, is now turning into 4 or 5 days of destructive fire weather. And for those of you who recall 2017 Napa fires, that fire just kept getting worse. And it built day over day as those destructive weather patterns repeated themselves. So the influence of topography, it has an influence on wind. As wind moves through draws and valleys, it increases. As wind moves over a ridge, there's an eddy or a lee, you see wind speed decreased. And then it also, in addition to its influence on wind, it affects fire spread rates because fire burns faster when it's going upslope due to convective and radiant preheating. As heat rises, if fuels are upslope of the fire, the rising heat passes through those fuels and preheats them and dries them and makes them more susceptible to combustion. Now, when you see topography and weather in alignment, you see increased spread rates. So if you have a fire running upslope downwind, that fire is going to really move. On the other hand, when you see a slope reversal and now it's burning downslope downwind, the fire will slow. And when you have a fire that's burning downslope downwind, it's now a backing fire, it's fighting both topography and weather, and it moves very, very slowly. So while the fire is burning, the spread rates are much lower, meaning we have more time to move people out of the way and more time to aggregate that effective firefighting force to fight it. The topography piece, though, is less relevant in a wind-driven fire where you can see downslope alignment with the winds that can cause tremendously fast high spread rates. And with those high winds, they can take a 30-foot flame length and just lay it flat to the ground. So while the flame lengths are 30 feet, the scorch heights on the trees are 3 to 5 feet. So that means all the rest of that flame length was laid down on the ground, preheating fuels and running ahead. And at the same time, those high winds contribute to ember casts being blown much farther in advance because the high winds can carry an ember farther before it burns out. So the next thing we'll talk about is the fuel load assessment. So with that understanding of what the weather and the topography and how the fuels interact, take a look at what exists in our area. So in our area, here's a great example. It's a picture from up in Briones. We have to take a look at wildfire fuel consisting of vegetation and structures. And so once we've taken those two general categories of what's available to burn, the next thing we have to do is we have to categorize it by its availability and what fuel model it's in. And in our case here, we'll use Rothermore's 13 fuel models where each parcel or pixel within an area is assigned a fuel that is of the many things that are there, the trees, the grass, the brush, the dead logs, all of those things. A categorization is made of which of those fuels is most likely to carry the fire. And that has to do with its configuration. That has to do with, is it small, is it large? How long will it take to ignite and start to burn? And how long will it take to equalize with the ambient environment? So if you look at the picture on the right there, we see trees and we see grass. I will tell you that in a wind-driven fire, the grass is the fuel that is most likely to carry the fire in that picture. A fire will run with the flames low to the ground through that grass. The grass will be rapidly consumed. It will support very high spread rates. The fire will not climb into those trees because one, those trees are relatively healthy. They're green, a lot of green foliage. They don't have, there's an absence of ladder fuels. You don't see a lot of dead stuff climbing up from the ground into the tree. and the fire will rip through there in the grass. And while some of those trees may burn, those trees will burn after the main body of fire has passed through. Therefore, while some of those trees may be consumed, they won't be the fuel that is most likely to carry the fire. We also take a look at, there's a fire trail running through there. Let's say it's 6 feet wide. Well, we know in fuel model 1 that that fire is going to produce flame lengths of 10 to 12 feet. And so if the flame lengths are going to be 10 to 12 feet with high wind speeds laying the flame angle down, then the fire will simply skip right over that road as if it were never there. On the other hand, if the road were widened or fuel mitigation measures are carried out on either side of the road with a mower to mow that fuel, so it's laid flat, it's not standing, the configuration has changed. It's not upright, it's not surrounded by air, it's not set up to support rapid spread rates. Now we see that a fire would be checked. It would be held by this line, the ground component. Embers might still fly over it, but it would certainly slow the fire and cause it to have to regenerate once it found a way across. So by assessing the environment and by determining the fuel most likely to carry the fire, and by running the calculations to determine spread rate and flame length, we can come up with a prescription of what it is taken under these modeled conditions to prevent a fire from crossing this feature. That's the sort of work we believe is necessary to informing a future CWPP, so that the work is done in a scientific manner to have the greatest benefit at the lowest cost and the least impact. Because if you were to try to run bulldozers through here to make that an 18-foot wide fire trail, disturbing the soil, creating the potential for sedimentation and runoff and earth flows and all those other things, that would be bad and would probably be not allowed by the land manager. On the other hand, a flat deck mower, tremendously non-impactful, reduces the cost and the disruption and so forth, or the introduction of something, of ruminants, something that graze, would have the same effect as mowing. And so by that manner, we're able to identify a number of adjuncts or prescriptions that can be used to address the fire risk in an area. And the last thing having to do with fuel I'd like to talk about is fuel moisture. So we talked about changing the configuration. Grass that's standing is very likely to burn. Grass that is laid down, while it will still burn, it will not burn with any intensity, and it won't produce great flame lengths, and the spread rates will be very slow through that grass. The second thing is fuel moisture. So in the case of grass, which is a 1 hour fuel, it equalizes its fuel moisture with the ambient environment in an hour. So it's categorized as a 1 hour fuel. Grass will not burn when its fuel moisture exceeds 12%. In the Bay Area, in the spring and the summer, when the fog comes in, the relative humidity is 100%. So within 1 hour of the fog coming in, the grass will have equalized with the ambient environment. It will have exceeded 12% fuel moisture. It is unavailable to burn. You can throw fire at it all day long, and that fire will not take and it will not burn. So that's one of the reasons that as we start to narrow down the risk we are modeling, we focus on those Diablo wind days when we combine high winds with low RH at late in the season periods when the fuels have not seen rainfall in months. And therefore, that's the most critical time and the most critical event that we're worried about addressing. So as I said before here, just because something will burn doesn't mean it materially contributes to fire spread. In that last picture, if some of those trees were to catch fire after the fire had passed through, we call it isolated torching. There would simply be a tree burning in the middle of a black field where all of the grass had already carried the fire. And the main body of fire would be far in advance of that point, or that location at that point, meaning that that tree is not contributing to the fire spread, meaning that that tree, either suppressing the tree or modifying the tree further or removing it in advance of a fire, is not going to impact the fire spread. It's not going to have a net positive benefit. So what we're looking at then is what's going to carry the fire and what is the prescription to prevent that thing from carrying the fire with the spread rate and the intensity that threatens lives and then homes. And that factor is ever changing based on environmental conditions. A fire modeled to burn in May when the grass is green will burn very, very differently than a fire burning in November when the grass is dead. A fire burning on a wind out of the west in the summer will behave very, very differently than a fire burning on winds driven out of the northeast. So that's just a way of saying that there is no one size fits all, but there is a prioritization of the conditions that we're most concerned about, and that is the Diablo wind events in the fall, characterized by north or northeast winds. Now, as I talked about before with the example of the large field and removing fuel in the middle versus on the perimeter, all fuel cannot be removed. It's not, it's cost prohibitive, it would cause enormous environmental damage, and it would fundamentally change the characteristics of our community, the semi-rural environment that people cherish. So what we are focusing on is on the fuels most likely to carry the fire under the most dangerous conditions. And if we modify those fuels, we mitigate the risk for those conditions at the lowest cost, cost measured in this case in time and effort it takes to reduce fuel, potential for environmental impact of fuel reduction, and then a change in the characteristic of the community. And it is reinforced by the fact that under non-critical conditions, under normal conditions or day when the fog is in and so forth, our fire suppression resources and efforts are much more likely to be successful because the fire won't spread at such speed and with such intensity that it will exceed our capacity to suppress it. We've had any number of these smaller fires in the last several years, all of which have been rapidly suppressed by the MOFT suppression folks, as well as mutual aid from surrounding resources, preventing them from growing because they were spreading at a rate with which we could get around them. That's not necessarily going to be the case, no matter how fast the response, no matter how skillful the firefighters are, no matter how well equipped. There's always the potential for natural conditions to create a fire that is explosive in nature, at which point we will shift our efforts to evacuation, to moving people out of its path. And that's why it's so important that we focus on the fuels that will support the fire spread under those conditions and do that in place of a concern about fires that fuel work that would reduce the threat of a fire that would spread under less threatening conditions. So this is just an example to illustrate the previous point about when you have high winds and you have a low flame angle, while flame length may still be very long, the flame height becomes relatively low as that fire is laid flat and runs along the ground. Here's another example, a picture from a recent North Bay fire. There's a couple things I would point out. You see the embers there, so that those embers are being blown in advance of the fire. And when they find a receptive fuel bed, they will light new fires, as you see as this fire has jumped the road, which the flame length would not support. So that was ember-driven fire across. The second thing you'll note, the embers are not wafting aloft like you would see from a campfire on a still night. They are laid to the ground by those high winds. And the last thing I would point out is you look at where the fire is burning. The fire is burning along the ground and the ground fuels. And you note that while there's no shortage of fire here, none of that fire is climbing up into the trees. So while the trees represent fuel, in this case, it's not available fuel because the fire doesn't have the ability to climb into the canopy. And where it does, it'll be isolated instances that will not materially contribute to the fire spread rates. So the next thing we look at when we come to categorization and the creation of the fuel inventories is we figure out the tons per acre. From those tons per acre, which is part of the model, you get spread rate and fire line intensities. If there are higher tons per acre, which is associated with the fuel type, you're going to have bigger fuels, right? A field full of trees, big trees, clearly will have a higher tons per acre than grass. And while there are more tons of fuel there, the fire will not spread as fast because those larger fuels will take longer to ignite. When they ignite, they'll burn very hot. They're just going to take a while to get burning. And so you see a lower spread rate. On the other hand, when you get things into grass, the fire is flying. So high spread rates, but lower fire line intensities. And grass and other light flashy fuels just don't have the ability to produce significant ember cast because the sparks and the things that come off of them burn out almost immediately because the fuel is so light. But there's another model, which is the worst of both, which is brush. So you see coyote brush or other decadent brush. You get a heavier or higher tons per acre because it's thick woody matter. But you get lots and lots of small twigs and other decadent material that's dead and kept in a vertical configuration and is available. You get a high chemical component, which contributes to the spread regardless of fuel moisture, and you get significant ember production. And that's sort of a worst of all cases. And that's one of the reasons we're very concerned about the prevalence of brush fields that have been putting a lot of time and effort into reducing those brush fields in the manners in which we're able to do so. The mentioned before, the moisture of extinction for grass is 12%, for brush it's 19%. And because brush is larger, it takes longer to equalize. So brush, depending on the conditions, will carry a fire on a foggy day for a significantly longer period than grass will. It's got to have a higher fuel moisture and it takes longer to reach that point. And then the cardinal direction of the slope, whether something is north, south, east, or west facing, that affects the fuel type, the moisture, and the density. Generally speaking, north-facing slopes have higher fuel loading, more trees, more brush. It's also going to have much greater density because there's more moisture available, because it's protected from the full value of the sun, and you'll see higher fuel moistures later into the season, but you'll see an awful lot more fuel. Where south-facing slopes tend to be more grass-dominated. So in this example from Briones, or it could very well have been from the GAD or any of the areas in South Moraga as well, we see a north-facing slope with a bay laurel oak mix. We see grass savanna with some encroaching brush up there on the slope on the top left. And we see these pockets of either oak or brush that are working up the creek beds. In this fuel model here, the grass is going to carry the fire, and the grass is going to rapidly carry the fire around those pockets of brush and trees. They may burn after the fact, although in the oaks it's much less likely, but the brush certainly will. They'll burn after the fact, and as the fire transitions into those brush fields, we will see a little bit of a reduction in spread rate, but not much, but an enormous increase in fire line intensity, and a tremendous increase in ember production. And as it moves into that north-facing slope, with that heavy overgrowth in the canopy, we see a significant reduction in spread rate because the fire is now working its way through the understory, but we also are unable to engage. You can't put firefighters mid-slope in that. So while the fire is not going to move as fast, we don't have the ability to put it out. But as a fire transitions through, as it changes slopes, as it changes fuel types, we'll expect to see different fire behavior. So the discussion of fuel load continues to talk about structures. Now, structures can and will burn in a wildfire. There's no question about that. However, in our environment, they are highly unlikely to be the fuel that is most likely to carry the fire. So the picture there is of Coffey Park in Santa Rosa from 2017. And in that location, fire spread home to home. Homes were the fuel most likely to carry the fire. However, in Coffey Park, they have parcels down about the size of 0.12 of an acre. And the distance between eaves was measured in single-digit feet. And there's very little vegetation. So in that case, fire transitioned from home to home to home to home with the wind driving the flames between the homes. In the district, there are a few isolated areas where that could happen. But due to the size of the lots, the property line offsets, and the variations in terrain, it is highly unlikely that homes will be most likely to carry the fire. That is not to say that homes won't burn, because they will. Just the main body of fire will have moved on and will have carried past those homes. So as the flaming front passes through, homes and heavy fuels continue to burn behind it. And homes that have defensible space and home hardening measures in place, those are passive measures which will protect the home under all conditions and fire scenarios. Homes that have ember-resistant vents, well-maintained roofs, and a good established defensible space around them are very unlikely to burn under these conditions. Now, there's no absolute here, but it significantly reduces the risk of home ignition. And as we see that those conditions spread throughout a community, and as more homes match those conditions, have home hardening and defensible space, we start to create a resilient home that is resistant to fire. And it's critical that this is done at scale, because one home in isolation surrounded by lots of overgrown lots and folks who haven't done the work, perhaps in proximity to a large open parcel, no amount of work under certain conditions will prevent the fire. But the work done by lots of members of the community has a compounding effect of being more beneficial and reducing the fire load and the risk and the fire spread rates and intensities and flame lengths that surrounding properties are exposed to, meaning that less defensible space work is required to protect that home. So there's a compounding effect. And when things are done at scale, across a community-wide scale, we can absolutely change the risk of wildfire that we face. So just one example, because there's been an awful lot of discussion that we've heard over the last couple of years about fire concerns as they relate to trees. So this is a picture from Paradise, from the Camp Fire in 2018. And in the foreground, you see the terrible destruction of a community that's been just utterly destroyed. But if you look in the background, note the tree canopies that are intact. So that while a tremendous fire passed through this area, that fire did not pass through in the canopies of the trees. That fire passed through either blown underneath the trees on the ground, or through three-dimensional ember casts, which found the void spaces of these structures and burned them from the inside. So while there are times and places that trees should be removed. Those times and places are very limited. And while there are times and places that trees should be trimmed or limbed to create an air gap, which is everywhere, the vast majority of our work, I believe, needs to focus on the ground fuels and the ladder fuels that will allow ground fuel to climb. And that while there are some trees that should be removed, most of our work does not need to be tree focused, because trees are not going to be the fuel that is most likely to carry the fire. So this is a fuel assessment of the prevalence of ladder fuels in our community. Dark is more ladder fuels, light is fewer ladder fuels. So this is one of the products we use when we start identifying where the highest priority areas are based on projected fire spread. Where is a fire going to move the most quickly and then through its movement cause the most damage? And those then become the areas that are prioritized. This next one is a surface fuel inventory. So this is the prevalence of the high fuel loads that will allow a fire to move rapidly and with high fire line intensity and long flame lengths through the ground fuels. And when high surface fuel concentrations come into contact with a prevalence of ladder fuels, then we start creating the potential to get those trees involved. And that's an area that we would certainly recommend targeting. This is a close-up of Moraga. You see the areas in the community where we have a high prevalence of surface fuels. Not surprisingly, the south-facing slopes, those areas where there's not a lot of tree canopy, we see more surface fuels. And on the north-facing, in this case, northeast-facing, say behind the Moraga Country Club, we see a much lower prevalence of surface fuels because the canopy created by that bay laurel mix on those north-facing slopes, that's screening out the light and reducing the amount of things that can grow on the ground underneath them. So out of those, we then run the models and we come up with our expected fire spread. Where are the areas that we think fire is going to move the most rapidly? It's going to threaten the most homes. And what are the steps that can be taken to prevent that fire from spreading in that area? Essentially, what is the minimum viable product for that modeled fire? Understanding that this is an imperfect science because we can't model every possible fire scenario, but we can model some that are representative. And out of that, we can derive suggestions for not only the location of the work, but the prescription for what should be done. So one of the things we use when we're doing that is we start with the fire hazard severity zone maps. These are produced by CAL FIRE. They're a little dated now, and we expect new ones sometime in the not too distant future. But what these tell us is this is what was CAL FIRE's best assessment when the maps were produced about what are the areas of the community that are exposed to the highest fire risk. And if you look at the district, and if you look at the La Orinda area in general, you see that Moraga, particularly the flat suburban areas of Moraga, have a much lower exposure to wildfire risk because they are sheltered due to the topography, the major ridge systems of Mulholland Ridge and Campo Ridge that divide the community and prevent a full value wind from being applied. And they're also protected by their distance from the large wilderness areas of the watershed to our north. So that for a large-scale fire to get to Moraga, with a few exceptions, it means it will have had to burn through Lafayette or Orinda and have jumped Highway 24 and it made its way south. Because all fires start small, and fires need time and distance in order to grow to a scale where they threaten an entire community and they exceed our capacity to suppress. So that's not to say Moraga is off the hook, because a large-scale fire to the north will absolutely rain embers down across the community. It's absolutely imperative that we take steps to reduce the prevalence of receptive fuel beds. But the scenarios for a north or northeast fire, because Moraga is south of Lafayette and Orinda, Moraga benefits from work that is done in those communities that disrupts a fire's ability, the ground component of a fire, its ability to spread. There's certainly some large open parcels that have the potential to create a fire in their own right. But that fire, while it could be large and it could cause destruction, it doesn't have enough runway, if you will, to grow to a size and intensity that it's just going to come roaring down off the hill. However, as I said before, it's very possible that a large fire to the north will rain embers across the community, many which have the potential to start fires every time they land on a receptive fuel bed. So when we look at topography, combined with what CAL FIRE has done, we look at topography, we look at the major north-south axes where a wind will be funneled and move with greater intensity. So we see coming down by St. Mary's, we see from Orinda coming through on Glorieta, down Moraga Way, down through by Ream, we see these areas through the center of town along Moraga Road. We see these areas where a wind, the topography will funnel the wind, and we'll see increased wind speeds and the potential for more erratic or increased fire behavior in those areas. Those also happen to sit, because of the way the road network is laid out, those happen to align with our evacuation routes, making roadside fuel reduction work in those areas of critical importance, so we can maintain the evacuation routes that we will need to move people out and firefighters in. So here's an example of the modeling. This was done in advance of the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break. So that's the Briones Reservoir on the left side, and that's Bear Creek Road and the Briones watershed there. The triangle represents the fire start point. The numbers shown on the top right of the model show the modeled weather conditions: 77-degree temperature, 8% humidity, and 15-mile-an-hour winds out of the northeast. And we see max flame lengths of 103 feet as fire moves through those decadent brush fields. We see spread rates at about 49 feet per minute, and we see very high BTUs. And as the fire gets down here along Bear Creek Road, there's a couple of spots where there are north-south draws that have the effect of funneling the fire and have supported heavier vegetation growth over the years, where the fire jumps Bear Creek Road and is now making a run into Orinda Downs and potentially across Ladderwasser Creek and moving towards Highway 24. So armed with that information, as we were designing the prescription for the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, we then came and modeled a series of fuel reduction steps along the Bear Creek Road, where the fire was most likely to jump the road and threaten those values at risk. Because while you cannot accurately predict the start point, and the Briones watershed is enormous, we can predict, based on a number of different potential start points, where the fire would jump the road on Bear Creek. And so we targeted fuel reduction efforts in those areas, so that the modeled outcome of that fuel reduction work is that the fire, all other factors being the same, does not jump Bear Creek Road in the model on the bottom. So that, at least based on the modeled outcome, that takes what could be a tremendously destructive fire running through high density neighborhoods in North Orinda and converts it to, while it is still a major fire, it's a major fire that put some flame on the ground in a bunch of watershed and in areas that are grazed. We would much rather have the outcome on the right than the outcome on the left. And this is a case where that work has been done. And under these conditions, the model says that work will now prevent a fire from spreading across Bear Creek Road, with the caveat that this is just a model. But we think it's a good start to inform science-driven, data-driven, thoughtful fuel reduction efforts to maximize the available resources and the available fuel reduction dollars while minimizing the environmental impact. So armed with that methodology and with that background and that understanding of not only the environment, but a fire spread, we get into the prioritizing of projects in our area. So one of the ways we do that is, this is a map of the district. And what this does, the color coding in the background is the estimated time for a resident in that area to make it to a freeway on-ramp, as in to be evacuated from the community. And the colored lines that are overlaid on top of that, each color is associated with a freeway on-ramp. So what this does is this explains an evacuation map viewing the community as a watershed, as in if every home, every roof is a drop of water that needs to flow to the ocean. And in this case, the ocean is Highway 24. And so it maps and models that route, and we see the feeders and the collectors and the major routes. And this has informed our enforcement efforts over the last couple of years as we've worked on increasing compliance with the fire code for roadside fuel reduction requirements, 3 feet back, 15 feet up, along those major evacuation routes where the greatest number of people have to pass by. And if you look at the purple street network, which is most of Moraga, all of that purple flows out through the Orinda on-ramp out Moraga Way. And that's why we've put so much effort in the last several years in education, outreach, and eventually enforcement of the roadside fuel reduction requirements on Moraga Way, because so many people have to get out. So this is another element to how we inform our discussion of prioritization, because while we are protecting life over property, we need to protect life not only in the home when it's static, but we need to protect life when it is dynamic, when it is on the move. And we do that by protecting the evacuation routes. So that's one of the elements we consider when prioritizing projects. Another element we consider when prioritizing projects is the ownership. Where are those large parcels? So this is a map our GIS team put together. It shows all of the parcels in the district, and this is just a blow up of Moraga in the southern zone, shows all the parcels that are greater than 10 acres. So that we can then contact the owners of those parcels, ensure they understand what the requirements are, the fire code requirements. And in this manner, we can take a big bite at scale. And on some of these 50 to a couple hundred acre parcels, we expect to see a rapid improvement because there's only a handful of owners we have to deal with. And our experience to date suggests dealing with the owners of parcels when you're requiring fuel mitigation work, it's laborious and time consuming. And if the net benefit of that time invested and of the staff resources put towards that problem is 50 to a couple hundred acres getting into compliance, well, that's absolutely worth the time. On the other hand, when the net benefit is a half acre getting into compliance, it's going to take us much longer to get to where we'd like to go. And so we see a good starting point and a good place to allocate the available enforcement resources is on these large parcels. And when these large parcels sit on top of a route where we have significant concerns about fire spread based on the speed it will spread, the intensity with which it will burn, and the number of homes it will threaten, and that seems like a very good place to allocate resources, enforcement resources right from the get-go. These are additional maps our team put together showing the surface fuel inventory on the left, or sorry, the ladder fuel inventory on the left and the surface fuel inventory on the right with those 10 acre or larger parcels overlaid. And this is one of the steps in the process to identifying where are those areas that have the greatest concentration of fuels of concern along those pathways where we're concerned about the effects of wind really amplifying a fire spread with the most homes downwind of them that are threatened. So the other piece when it comes to prioritizing projects is building upon the work that's already been done. We've already done work. There's a compounding effect with projects at this scale, just as there is with the creation of defensible space at the homeowner level. So our big push in 2019 was the creation of the North-Orinda Shaded Fuel Break. It was funded by a $4.25 million grant from the state of California. We carried it out, converting a little over 19 acres or 19.25 miles and 1,400 acres in the project. And now we're in the process of maintaining it through the use of prescribed fire. So in the bottom center there, you see a shot of a macerator out reducing decadent coyote brush in the summer of 2019. And in the top right, you see a picture from the fall of 2020, where we went out under Dennis Rain's leadership and put fire on the ground in conjunction with work with the California Native Plant Society to spread a native grass and wildflower seed mix. And it's a process of converting that from decadent coyote brush back to native fire-resistant grasslands. And that part of that takes maintenance, part of that takes putting fire on the ground on a regular basis to try to scorch off that coyote brush that's really making a return from a tremendously resilient root ball. We continue to work with Caltrans on their obligation to maintain the state-owned lands along Highway 24. That is a work in progress. We're not done. We are not satisfied with their efforts, and there's more to be done. But we think that's a critical element to build upon the North-Orinda Shaded Fuel Break to create, call it the Highway 24 Fuel Break, and it makes sure that those shoulders are maintained so a fire is less likely to jump the freeway, and the freeway is less likely to be negatively impacted by flame and fire, because that's the route we're going to move residents out and responders in. We continue to carry out our efforts on evacuation routes, inspections, and citations. We've done an awful lot of those. Some are going to require more work, but we continue to prioritize those because of the massive number of people that are going to move down the very small number of available routes. We continue to provide chipping support to neighborhoods, specifically targeting those neighborhoods that have become firewise and are organized in that manner, while coming back to maintain our projects where possible with prescribed fire and to use prescribed fire to reduce the encroachment of some of the woody material that is preventing the reintroduction of cows to graze. As well as mentioned before, with some emerging efforts that require more research and study, but we are committed to about uses of fire to convert brush fields back to native fire-resistant grasses. The North-Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, as described here, is designed to interrupt the continuity of the fuel bed along the northern perimeter of the community so that the ground component of a fire coming out of the Briones watershed will be slowed or stopped. This is intended to be the first in a series of projects that we hope in time will bring the district, and I'll talk about more of that in a moment. This is shots of members of our team out putting fire on the ground along Wildcat Canyon Road in the El Toinal and the Orinda Horsemen's Association area, coming back in April of this year to clear out some of the things that had fallen and deposited after the big push in July of 19 to clear this area. We'll continue to be committed to this, and we are grateful for the community's consideration about the smoke that it produces and the inconvenience and the challenges that it faces being in a community that's exposed to smoke for portions of a day while we're burning. But we continue to think this is the most efficient, most effective, and best fit for our environment as a way to maintain these projects and reintroduce fire to the landscape. This is an example of a fuel break that we created through the judicious application of fire at Painted Rock in Moraga. This was from last year. This area had not been grazed in I believe, almost 20 years. And when it transferred to the John Muir Land Trust, we have an excellent partner there, and we are helping them through the application of fire to convert this back to where it would be possible to reintroduce cows, because if the area is grazed, it will not burn with any intensity. This is a subsequent burn. On the left there, you see the fire working its way down the hill. As I mentioned before, when fire is fighting both topography and weather, it burns very slowly. And on the right, you see the end result where we burned right down to the road. And for those of you who were able to witness that, I'm sure you noted that as that fire came down that hill, it was moving very slowly in a very controlled manner. Here is just across from there. Here we see prescribed fire over on Campo Ridge. Campo Orinda High School is just to the left. You see that, that really thick growth of thistle and brush. Put fire on the ground out there as a way to help remove these heavy fuel load concentrations, and we hope set the stage for the reintroduction of cattle. Let's see if I can get off this slide. Great, and here's the end result. You see there, here we've burned out that section. We've created a good perimeter around it. And then if you look in the background here on the top right, you can see the work that was done to put fire on the ground over at Painted Rock. So in this manner, our projects are building on each other. They're setting the stage for reintroduction of cattle, which I believe is a long-term solution for many of these parcels. And they start to create these internal fuel breaks where our prescribed fire projects touch up against each other. And we've now created a strip of land that is less likely to burn or will burn at a much lower intensity, buying time for evacuations, protecting the route, Ream down below, and of the Campo neighborhood to the north there, and giving time for us to bring firefighters in an attempt to hold the fire at this location. As I mentioned before, our FireWise communities, we have a number of them. We're excited about a number more, several more that are coming online right now. This is an excellent way for folks to organize, to do fuel reduction, and to help communicate to the outside world, to insurance companies specifically, about how serious this community takes fire risk. There is a FireWise Council in Orinda that is a tremendous resource, has helped quite a number of folks get their communities organized, and is a great resource as we encourage people to continue to get on board and to get organized as FireWise communities. We're happy to provide support. We're happy to provide chipping support and other adjuncts that will help these communities reduce risk. What the district is not well positioned to do is the grassroots organizing. And we need the help of all interested community members who are aware of the threat to help organize their communities so that we have organized blocks with whom we are working that makes our resources go much farther than when we are starting from scratch. I will not belabor these 7 lines of effort, but as I mentioned before, there is no one solution. There is no one thing we can do to make fire go away. There's no magic bullet, there's no pill. These are the 7 lines of effort of the MOFD Wildfire Prevention Strategic Plan. I continue to stand by them and believe these 7 lines of effort, when executed in parallel, represent a pathway for our community to fundamentally reduce our exposure to wildfire. The CWPP and the projects that we believe should be prioritized and identified through this process, they are in alignment with line of effort number 1 and number 2, and the other lines of effort are absolutely in support. So as talked about before, we have to, in our way forward and our pathway and our planning of projects, we have to explore both macro and micro projects in parallel, not to exclusion of each other. So while it's appropriate for the district and the other large, the surrounding landowning agencies or resource agencies or private entities that own large portions of land, while it's appropriate to work on large projects that will be carried out on the perimeter and to reduce those large undeveloped interior islands, that is not enough alone. And it's critical that small parcel defensible space work and home hardening is happening on a parcel by parcel basis by all residents. And that it is not acceptable to assume that those macro projects being carried on the perimeter are going to make our community safe. There's a role for everyone to play in this. And every community or every resident in the community has a role to play to ensure that their parcel is hardened and that their defensible space is established. So as I mentioned before, with the prioritization, we look at where a project, the conditions on that project represent the greatest risk to lives, both lives when they're static in place in their homes and they're dynamic during the course of an evacuation. We then look at prioritization of risk to property, and then lastly, risk to responders. And when we get projects that align with all three of those become the obvious starting point. And then we look at lowest cost. So if we can get great return at low cost, and cost isn't just measured in dollars, it's measured in access and site approval. Do we have the authority to do the work? Do we have a willing partner who will let us onto that land to carry out work? Or is the regulatory environment such that it is possible to do the work? There are a number of federally protected endangered species in our area that limit either the ability to do work, period, or limit the means that can be used. It takes certain prescriptions, particularly mechanical removal. It makes them, they're not approved for those sites. They can't be used. After that, we look at site access. Can you even get to the area where the work needs to be done? On the middle of a north-facing slope with no road, it's just not possible to access those sites with equipment and the people and the manpower that you would need to make a significant dent. So in those areas, we'd really be constrained to working on the perimeter and the outlying areas because getting into the core of it is just not possible based on site access. And the last one you look at when it comes to cost is what's there. If it's light, flashy fuels, you can make a quick whack at that with, with weed eaters or whatever else. It's going to grow back the next year. So you have to consider that. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you're into heavy timber, into big trees, it's going to take an awful lot of folks, an awful lot of time to work through those trees without using an awful lot of equipment. So the size and type and configuration of the fuel, the access, the approvals to work on that site, all of that go into what's the cost in time, effort, and resources to reduce the risk on that parcel. And then lastly, we believe the work that has been done to date is good. It is absolutely, it's made a measurable reduction in risk. There's much more to be done, but we think anything going forward should expand upon those projects rather than starting with a blank piece of paper. Another way we prioritize projects, I talked about before, is proximity to values at risk. We need to recognize and understand that we cannot eliminate all ember producing fuels. And that's why it's so important that we reduce receptive fuel beds near homes, near the evacuation routes, and then within homes. So near homes, that's creation of defensible space. Near the evacuation routes, we're really talking about 3 feet back, 15 feet up, a fuel clearance required by the current fire code. And then within homes, we're talking about home hardening through the introduction of ember resistant vents and screens to prevent embers from finding those void spaces where there's available fuel. And if you look at the right, this is showing the distance from Vallejo to the Cumming Skyway there. And last year, a fire was burning in Vallejo, and all of a sudden, a fire broke out on the Cumming Skyway. That fire was spread by embers, probably a tumbleweed or something, some big piece of brush that blew across the Carquinez Street over the town of Crockett, 1.6 miles to the south, where ignited another fire that spread to be a significant fire in its own right. And so through all of these steps, we intend to create a varied fuel mosaic, and that replicates the conditions on the ground here in pre-European historical times when fire burned through the area in a low intensity manner every 3 to 5 years. And when a fire burns through in that low intensity, it's beneficial to the landscape. The fire adapted elements of the ecosystem thrive. Knobcone pines release their seeds. The soil is refreshed underneath the sequoias and the redwoods. All of those things are a product of good fire, and good fire in this case being a low intensity, regular recurring fire that creates a varied fuel mosaic. And when we see these mega fires as a result of the exclusion of fire and that we've allowed fuels to accumulate and reach these high fuel loads and set the stage for critical fire danger and explosive high intensity fires that just sweep everything off the landscape in their path. So we're seeking through this process to replicate the historic burn cycle. That doesn't mean we're going to burn through residential neighborhoods every 3 to 5 years, but fuel reduction work that creates that defensible space, it can be used to replicate those historic burn patterns and create that varied fuel mosaic that prevents a fire from becoming explosive and so damaging. So from a prioritization of projects, as a general summary, what we see as the areas that need to be prioritized are large parcels north of populated areas. Anytime you have a large area full of combustive vegetation that has not been maintained, that is not managed in a way that would control the spread rate and the intensities of a fire, those areas absolutely need to be maintained. In our area, what that comes down to is some land owned by the East Bay Mud, Painted Rock, the GAD, some of those other large parcels in or immediately to the northeast of Moraga proper, the populated portions of Moraga, and then county roads, who has an obligation to maintain their roadsides that run through many of these areas where roadside work can be used not only to secure the evacuation route, but to ensure that that road will act as a fire break that will slow or stop the spread of fire. We continue to work with Caltrans on their obligation to maintain the state-owned land on Highway 24. I think that is critical to the community safety. Working on those large interior parcels, as I mentioned before, and then every resident starting with their roadside clearance. Now, we would love to see that move on to defensible space and home hardening, but a great place to start is roadside clearance, because the work done on a roadside, not only does that benefit that home by reducing the likelihood that the home will have a negative outcome when exposed to fire, and increasing the likelihood that those residents will be able to evacuate, but there's a common good to it that every resident who lives upstream of that house and and to the people in that house, the benefits of the work done by every home downstream of them to ensuring that they have the ability to evacuate down a route that is unlikely to be affected by direct flame impingement, because that good roadside clearance has been done. And then lastly, as I mentioned, the defensible space and the home hardening. And as folks are doing that and getting organized as a neighborhood, it makes great sense to become involved in the NFPA Firewise USA program. And the Orinda Firewise Council and other folks who have already gone before are great resources to help neighbors helping neighbors become more aware of the program and organize their own neighborhoods. Things we are doing while the CWPP moves forward. We have proposed a grant request to run a fuel break, an extension of the North Orinda shaded fuel break from Orinda up and around Cal Shakes and Wilder, down through Lost Valley, Indian Valley, around Sanders and out to St. Mary's and to Bollinger. You see an outline of it there. We submitted that on the 2019-2020 fire prevention grant application period. No large projects were selected that year, but we are hopeful that as the governor's proposal for a major wildfire initiative moves forward, that this project will be reconsidered. We've submitted it for consideration, and we are hopeful that the state will value not only its proximity to the work that was previously done on the North Orinda shaded fuel break, but the valuable experience that the MOFD staff gained through the execution of that project, and our demonstrated ability to execute projects on time in a transparent manner, accounting for all of the taxpayer dollars and in an effective manner. We were successful in that project, and we hope that success will be weighted in the selection of this next round of grants, and we believe this is a grant that will have regional benefit. We also continue to work with the Dabla Fire Safe Council. These are micro grants to individual neighborhoods. They're about $5,000 per project. We've been able to use the MOFD chipping program as a way to leverage this. We're currently executing, by short, I mean 6 weeks from notification to all money expended. We're currently executing a $75,000 short notice grant in that same way, these micro grants by neighborhood, augmenting existing neighborhood efforts. And we have high hopes for the governor's 2021 wildfire initiative, and we're tracking that closely to ensure that our projects are appropriately considered. This is just a refresher. I would hope everyone here either knows about defensible space or following it takes the time to look it up. But this is not only a best practice, not only something that will protect your home and your family, but it's a requirement both by the MOFD Fire Code and by state law. The general exemption for CEQA for fuel reduction work is 35 feet. We filed a notice of exemption back in July that expands that to 100 feet from homes. So with a few exceptions for your average home, everything within 100 feet, which ought to be the majority of the parcel, is exempt from CEQA, meaning that you are cleared to go out and do fuel reduction work in the area. Now, there's some other things, if it's a native tree and some other things that certainly need to be considered. But the point is that there is a understanding of not only the need, but a legal requirement to go out and do this work. And the benefit accrues not only to your family that may be in that home and to your property that's definitely in that home, but then to the community as a whole. As more people do this, the community becomes safer. And in this area, every little bit helps. If you have a large parcel and it's got heavy accumulations of fuel, while that is a daunting project, starting with the first 3 feet or 5 feet immediately adjacent to the home is a great place to start. Start clearing out the fuel in that area and then start working out in concentric rings, working farther and farther away from the home, where you're removing or modifying those ground fuels, you're trimming and limbing the standing fuels, and you're creating a varied mosaic on a micro scale on your parcel. Ember-resistant roof vents, and for those few remaining wood shake roofs replacement, ember-resistant vents are a very cost-effective and just a good way to prevent blown embers from finding those gaps. And really sort of the tragedy on some of these things is that defensible space work has been done. The fire burned around the home, and the defensible space work was adequate and prevented the ground component of fire from impinging upon the home. And blown embers made their ways through vents or other openings into the void spaces. And between hours or days after the main body of fire moved through, the house burns to the ground. So hardening the home and vents are a great way to do that. Is an effective way to add depth and resiliency to our community's risk reduction and wildfire reduction efforts. So in summary, a couple of things. So we are continuing to work on large projects to create and maintain a perimeter around the district. Those projects emphasize high fire risk, low cost areas to the north of populated regions or portions of the community. We're continuing to pursue grant money for these large projects. We continue to work with the large parcel owners as we identify them and educate, outreach, and eventually site or even lien those large interior projects. And we continue to work on getting Caltrans to meet their own requirements for fuel reduction work along Highway 24, which they are currently not doing. We continue to focus on roadside fuel reduction as a great starting point for every resident in the community to get their roadside into compliance, while encouraging residents to begin or expand upon the work of creating the defensible space around their home to comply with the fire code and state law, and to consider judicious home hardening efforts like replacing your vents. And then we also, in partnership with our partners at the police department, the city, and the town, we continue to work on evacuation planning and exercises in recognition that no matter what the community does, there still is the possibility that there will be a fire that exceeds our capacity to suppress, and we're still going to rapidly need to move the community out while flowing firefighting resources in. And then the last step in tonight's discussion or presentation is how you provide your input. So tonight was the last of the public presentations. They're available on our website in a video form for anyone who either wants to review a portion or wants to suggest it to someone who was not present. I would say you don't need to watch all three. Because with the exception of the assessment, which is specific to each community, the rest of them, they're the same. There will then be public hearings are scheduled. That will be discussed at the MOFD board meeting on February 17th, and the board will provide direction with regard to when to schedule those and how to proceed. There is a comment form on our website. It's shown there by a blue arrow in the bottom left. If you go to our website and you type in CWPP, this comes right up. Coming out of the public hearing that is the board will schedule, which will be another opportunity for members of the community to provide input. Then there'll be an adoption hearing where there'll be another opportunity for residents to provide input on the final product. And then after the MOFD board hopefully has approved it, the CWPP will move to the County Board of Supervisors where there will be a hearing and we hope adoption, at which point the CWPP will be in effect and will be revisited in 3 years, where we come back to assess the work that has been done. That concludes our presentation for tonight. Dennis or Jeff, I will turn it to you if there's any questions we need to answer live that we weren't able to answer in the chat.
Chief, I think we were pretty much able to keep up with all the questions that came in the chat. If anybody has any other ones, they can post them right now and we'll get right back to them. Doesn't look like any are popping up. You did a great job, boss.
Okay, well, thank you all. So having talked for an hour and a half and noting the time and thanking everyone for their attention, thank you for joining us. We would encourage you to take a look at the CWPP. Please provide your input and please share this information with others you think might be interested. And just the last thing I will leave you with is we're trying very hard on this and we absolutely need your help. No amount of planning, no amount of activity on the fire district's part is going to change the need for residents to create that defensible space and to harden their homes for us to be successful. This is going to take a whole of community effort. This problem was formed over years and years, and it's going to take a significant amount of time and effort to fix it. I think we have the luxury of time in this case and the luxury of advance warning. While communities around us have suffered horrific loss, that we have the luxury of being informed by that, of being aware of what fire in the current environment can do, of understanding that this is not a transitory condition. It's not even the new normal. This is a return to the old normal. And this is just part of living in California. And we have this limited window. We have this opportunity to get ahead of this problem, learning from the losses of neighborhoods and communities in our immediate surroundings, where many of us may know people who live there and have suffered loss. And if we squander this opportunity when there is a big fire, which is just statistically inevitable, when that happens, we're going to wish we had done more. And this is our opportunity to do more. And I would encourage you all, please work with us to create that defensible space, harden your home, spread the word, help increase awareness. It's much more powerful when that awareness is spread from neighbor to neighbor, and we need your help. With that, thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing your comments. Thank you to Dennis and to Jeff and to Marcia for all of your help in putting this together. And we will see you all next time. Thank you.